So it's an unbelievable good preservation of this enclosure, which had been erected by Stone Age people so long ago and which is still existent now here.
In the summer of 2014, Klaus Schmidt, the man who uncovered Gobeklitepe, collapsed beside a swimming pool in Germany. A sudden heart attack ended his life, but not before he left one final confession to his closest colleagues.
We have monumental architecture so early in the history of mankind, so we didn't expect it to have it so early. Nearly 7,000 years before the pyramids, which are the first monumental building everyone knows. It doesn't change history, but it adds a chapter.
His words were urgent, almost panicked. I can't keep this hidden. What he found didn't show the rise of civilization. It showed its first collapse, a fragile recovery that rewrites everything we thought about human progress. But what exactly did Schmidt uncover beneath those quiet Turkish streets that scared him so much? The hidden site that haunted Schmidt. The terrifying truth Klaus Schmidt hinted at before his death wasn't about Gobeklitepe, the place plastered across documentaries and glossy travel posters. No. The site that haunted him was far humbler and far more unsettling. Just 4 shallow mounds, tucked beneath the edges of modern buildings, almost invisible in the landscape. This wasn't Gobeklitepe's grand stage of stone circles and pillars. This was Gürcütepe, a site so unremarkable to the eye that most people walked past it without knowing they were brushing shoulders with a secret that could rewrite human history. Think about it. How many times have we been told civilization starts with temples, cities, and kings? The story feels clean, like a ladder we climb rung by rung. Gobeklitepe seemed to fit that story. Monumental, mysterious, the world's first temple. But here's the twist. Schmidt discovered that just a few kilometers away lay this other site, Gürcütepe. And it wasn't a temple. It wasn't a shrine. It was a cluster of homes. Back in 1995, Schmidt and his team plumbed the soil at Gürcütepe. What they found wasn't grandeur, it was intimacy. Mud brick walls outlining small, rounded houses. Every day, tools chipped from stone. Figurines shaped by hand, rough but unmistakably human. These weren't the towering T-shaped pillars of Gobeklitepe. They were traces of people living together, cooking, carving, and sharing. And this is where Schmidt's obsession began. Because Gürcütepe and Gobeklitepe weren't just neighbors in geography, they were neighbors in time. But the story they told together didn't line up neatly. Instead, they clashed. Let me explain. Gobeklitepe screamed monumentality. It looked like the birthplace of gods, a place where humans gathered in awe to build something beyond themselves. But Gürcütepe whispered domesticity, community, survival. It looked like the recovery after something had gone terribly wrong. Schmidt realized the contrast wasn't just architectural, it was chronological. Gürcütepe sat inside the very same period as Gobeklitepe, and yet it painted a completely different picture of what life was like. And here's the detail that gnawed at him: the material culture. The tool assemblages at Gürcütepe were simpler, even cruder, than what he'd seen elsewhere. The figurines weren't elaborate art. They were almost desperate, like someone trying to hold on to a memory. For Schmidt, it was like staring at a civilization in rehab. Not ascending, but rebuilding from collapse. Why would a culture capable of raising megaliths suddenly produce something that looked like the remnants of survival households? Was this evidence of a golden age followed by catastrophe? Did Gobeklitepe rise and fall? And did Gürcütepe mark the fragile human attempt to start again? These were the questions that began to torment him. Archaeology isn't supposed to feel like ghost hunting, but Schmidt admitted to colleagues that Gürcütepe gave him chills. It wasn't the beauty of discovery, it was the weight of contradiction. Because if the timeline was right, then humanity's earliest story wasn't a steady march upward. It was a cycle: monument, collapse, recovery. And that terrified him. Imagine if you were Klaus Schmidt. The world celebrates you as the man who uncovered the world's first temple. Headlines frame you as the discoverer of human civilization's dawn. And yet, in the quiet corners of your work, you find a site that undercuts the whole narrative. Would you tell the world? Would you risk your legacy to admit civilization didn't just rise? It stumbled, maybe catastrophically, before it rose again? That's why Gürcütepe stuck in his mind until his very last days. He could point to Gobeklitepe and bask in the spotlight. But every time he returned to the mounds near Gürkü, he felt he was staring at the real story. And it wasn't uplifting. It was fragile, haunting, and almost too dangerous to put into words. Because here's the thing, the artifacts were one piece of the puzzle, but it was the dating, the cold, scientific timeline, that turned Schmidt's unease into dread. When radiocarbon results began to emerge, they didn't just place Gürcütepe in the shadow of Gobeklitepe. They suggested a sequence that shattered the clean story of progress we've all been taught. So, what exactly did the dates reveal? And why did they leave Klaus Schmidt so shaken that, before he died, he called Gürcütepe the terrifying truth no one was ready to hear? The terrifying timeline discovery. The dates. That was the breaking point for Klaus Schmidt. Because when the radiocarbon results came back, they didn't confirm what everyone expected. They didn't show Gürcütepe standing alongside Gobeklitepe, like two siblings sharing the same historical moment. Instead, they revealed something far darker. Gürcütepe came after Gobeklitepe's abandonment, and that single fact flips the whole story. Because if Gobeklitepe was the first great monument of human civilization, then Gürcütepe wasn't its partner. It was its aftermath, a society trying to pick up the pieces. The terrifying truth Schmidt carried until his death was that humanity's first real experiment in complexity had already collapsed. Think about how unsettling that is. We're used to imagining history as a straight line, from hunter-gatherers to farmers, from villages to cities, from pyramids to skyscrapers. But the sequence from Gobeklitepe to Gürcütepe doesn't feel like a straight line at all. It feels like a rise, a fall, and then a desperate attempt to rebuild. And Schmidt wasn't guessing. He had receipts. The architecture was the first clue. Gobeklitepe was all about monumentality. Giant T-shaped pillars carved with animals, circles arranged with mathematical precision, and stonework so advanced it looked out of place for 10,000 BC. But when Schmidt's team dug into Gürcütepe, what they found looked humble. Small mud brick houses, low walls, hearths for cooking, figurines that looked rushed, almost improvised. It wasn't just smaller, it was a completely different mindset. Archaeologists describe this shift in terms of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Gobeklitepe belonged to the pre-pottery Neolithic B, a period of ambition and complexity. Gürcütepe, by contrast, belonged to the pre-pottery Neolithic C, the moment after the lights went out. The grand temples were abandoned, the stone circles deliberately buried, and in their place, people huddled in small homes, building not monuments, but shelters. And here's where the 2021 and 2022 excavations confirmed what Schmidt had always suspected. Teams revisiting Gürcütepe with modern tools found that the layers really did date later than Gobeklitepe. The soil, the artifacts, the radiocarbon. Everything pointed to continuity, but continuity after collapse. In other words, Gürcütepe wasn't the younger sibling of Gobeklitepe, it was the orphan. So why did this happen? Why would a society capable of lifting megaliths suddenly retreat into tiny homes? The answer lies in what some researchers now call the fragility thesis. The idea is simple but terrifying. Even humanity's earliest attempts at complexity were fragile. Monumental society wasn't sustainable forever. It cracked. Maybe environmental change, maybe social stress, maybe both. And when it did, people fell back on the basics: food, shelter, survival. The terrifying truth about Gürcütepe isn't just that it came later. It's that it represents humanity's first documented social collapse. The first time people built something extraordinary, only to watch it unravel. That's the real ghost Klaus Schmidt carried. Because he realized this wasn't a one-off. History is filled with collapses. Rome, the Maya, Angkor, even modern systems teeter when pushed. And the cycle seems to stretch all the way back to our very beginnings. But let's get specific. What do we actually know about why Gobeklitepe fell? One theory centers on the environment. Around 8,200 BC, the Earth experienced what's called the 8.2 kilo-year event, a sudden, sharp cooling that lasted more than a century. Crops failed, hunting grounds changed, entire regions faced scarcity. Imagine living in a society that just poured generations of labor into building massive temples, only to watch the climate shift beneath your feet. Suddenly, the resources that made that monument possible vanish. In that context, smaller, tighter communities like Gürcütepe make sense. Another angle is social. Monuments like Gobeklitepe don't build themselves. They require organization, labor coordination, and belief systems that keep hundreds of people moving in the same direction. But organization comes with stress. Hierarchies form, conflicts erupt, and factions split. Some scholars argue that Gobeklitepe wasn't just abandoned because of the climate. It may have collapsed under its own weight, socially unsustainable for the long haul. Whatever the cause, the evidence is clear. The pillars were buried, not toppled. Someone made a deliberate choice to cover the temples with earth, as if to close a chapter. And only after that do we see places like Gürcütepe, where life is simpler and humbler, but still persists. Humanity didn't vanish. It regrouped. And that brings us back to the fragility thesis. The idea that complexity doesn't equal stability. In fact, the more complex a society becomes, the more vulnerable it might be to shocks. We see that pattern echo through history. Golden ages followed by crashes, and renaissances shadowed by decline. Klaus Schmidt saw Gürcütepe as the first proof of that cycle. And that's what terrified him enough to whisper it before his death. Because if even the first chapter of civilization wasn't a clean beginning, but a stumble and a recovery, what does that say about us now? Are we really on a straight march toward progress? Or just moving through another fragile cycle, waiting for the next collapse? And that's where Schmidt's terror deepened. It wasn't just the dates. It wasn't just the mud brick houses. It was the growing sense that the collapse of Gobeklitepe wasn't random. There were clues, hints of what actually caused it. Clues that might explain not just humanity's first collapse, but why collapse keeps repeating, again and again, across history. So, what really caused the fall of the world's first temple builders? And why does it keep happening, no matter how advanced we become? The collapse pattern Schmidt feared. The deeper Schmidt studied the layers at Gürcütepe, the more his fear grew. It wasn't just that Gobeklitepe had fallen. It was how it had fallen, because the fingerprints of that collapse looked eerily familiar. They matched the same forces that have torn down empires thousands of years later. And the most chilling part? The very first collapse in human history already mirrored every other one that followed. Think about what happened. The climate changed. Around 8,200 BC, a sudden global cooling event shook the region. Crops failed before farming was fully stable. Wild herds shifted away. For people who relied on both hunting and the fragile beginnings of agriculture, this wasn't a setback. It was survival threatened at scale. Imagine watching the world you built, with its great stone circles, suddenly become too expensive to maintain when food itself was scarce. But the climate was only half the story. The other half was social. Monuments like Gobeklitepe didn't rise without coordination, hierarchy, and ritual. Power had to concentrate, labor had to be managed, and belief systems had to hold everyone together. And here's the thing: the same forces that make monuments possible also make societies brittle. Once resources shrank, the cohesion cracked. The glue of ritual and order no longer held. That's the cycle Schmidt recognized. Environmental stress plus social strain equals collapse. Rome faced it. The Maya faced it. Angkor faced it. And here, in the very first monumental society on Earth, the same pattern had already played out. Now, what makes Gürcütepe so haunting is the aftermath. When people abandoned Gobeklitepe, they didn't vanish into dust. They adapted. Excavations show smaller mud brick homes, domestic hearths, and figurines with new symbolic styles. Life became practical. Communities turned inward. The grand carvings of lions and vultures gave way to the quiet rhythm of survival. In other words, people scaled down. They swapped temples for kitchens, gods for household rituals. That choice, the deliberate scaling down, was humanity's first reset button. And it tells us something crucial. Collapse is rarely the end. It's the shift to a different way of living. Civilizations fall, but people persist. They rebuild smaller, leaner, and sometimes wiser. Gürcütepe proves it. But here's the part Schmidt couldn't shake. If collapse is baked into the story from the very beginning, then maybe complexity itself is the trap. The more we build, the more fragile we become. And that's not just an ancient problem. That's our problem. Ask yourself this: are we really so different today? Our monuments aren't carved limestone pillars, but glass skyscrapers and global digital networks. Our rituals aren't stone circles, but stock markets, social media, and political systems. And just like Gobeklitepe, they only work when resources flow and cohesion holds. But what happens when climate stress, inequality, and resource depletion start shaking that foundation? Doesn't it sound familiar? Schmidt's terrifying truth about Gürcütepe was that collapse isn't an accident of history. It's a recurring pattern. Civilization grows ambitious, stretches beyond its safety net, and then faces the pushback of nature and society. When that happens, people don't disappear. They retreat, regroup, and start smaller. It happened in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago, and it's happened again and again ever since. And here's the kicker: even the symbolic systems change. At Gobeklitepe, towering pillars carried cosmic meaning, etched with foxes, cranes, and snakes. At Gürcütepe, symbolism shrank to handheld figurines and local shrines. The big story turned into small stories, tailored to survival. Isn't that exactly what we see after modern collapses, too? Large-scale ideologies shatter, and people cling to community, to family, and to the small rituals that keep them sane when the big systems fail. So, when Klaus Schmidt lay dying in 2014, what haunted him wasn't just the chronology. It was the realization that the first collapse already contained the blueprint for all the others. Climate stress, resource depletion, social fracture, retreat into survival. That's the pattern. That's the cycle. And if that cycle began with the very first temple, it raises the question, is collapse not the exception, but the rule? Schmidt feared we are living inside that same script today, because he didn't just see Gürcütepe as a chapter in prehistory. He saw it as a mirror, a warning that our skyscrapers, our networks, and even our global order are just another Gobeklitepe, majestic, ambitious, and fragile. The collapse that follows may not look identical, but the echoes are too close to ignore. So, when you look at our world right now, the climate pressures, the fractured politics, the strain on resources, does it feel like we're on the rise? Or does it feel like we're standing where Gobeklitepe once stood, just before the burial began? That was the terrifying truth Klaus Schmidt revealed about Gürcütepe before he died. That collapse isn't ancient history. It's human history. A cycle written into the DNA of civilization itself. But here's the haunting twist. In his final months, as his own body began to fail, Schmidt became obsessed with preserving this lesson. Not because it was about the past, but because he believed it was already happening again. Right now, in our modern world. And that brings us to the real question. What exact signs did Schmidt see in our time that convinced him the cycle was repeating? Schmidt's final warning. As Klaus Schmidt's health faltered in 2014, his urgency sharpened. Friends remembered how the man who once spoke endlessly of Gobeklitepe's beauty now spoke with a tremor in his voice about its fragility. It wasn't just about ancient collapse, it was about ours. He knew the site itself was under threat. Not from shifting ice ages or failing crops this time, but from bulldozers, concrete, and urban sprawl creeping ever closer. Just as environmental stress had once forced early builders to abandon Gobeklitepe, modern development threatened to erase the very evidence of that lesson. Imagine spending your life unearthing humanity's first warning about collapse, only to watch the present repeat the same blindness. That was Schmidt's fear. He often reminded colleagues that Gobeklitepe and Gürcütepe weren't frozen relics. They were mirrors. They showed us that civilizations grow fragile the moment they believe their achievements make them untouchable. In his final months, he argued that the story written in those stones mattered not for the past, but for the present. Humanity's oldest temple had collapsed under forces it couldn't control, and he saw the same pattern emerging today in our climate, our politics, and our sprawling cities. And that's why his warning hit so hard. It wasn't just an archaeologist's nostalgia. It was a plea. He feared we were ignoring the same signals, the strain on resources, the cracks in social cohesion, the reckless belief that growth can stretch forever. In his view, Gürcütepe's greatest gift was not its carvings, but its caution. Learn from collapse, or live it again. Think about it. When you walk past a glass tower in a modern city, how different is it really from a pillar carved with animals 10,000 years ago? Both are symbols of ambition. Both require enormous coordination, resources, and faith in a stable future. And both can crumble faster than we expect when the foundation shifts. Schmidt wanted us to see that parallel before it was too late. And so his legacy wasn't just discovery, it was warning. He believed that If we truly understood the cycle of rise and collapse written in Gürcütepe's soil, maybe, just maybe, we could break it. But the question remains, will we actually heed Klaus Schmidt's terrifying warning, or are we destined to repeat the same cycle that Gürcütepe first documented 10,000 years ago? So maybe the terrifying truth Klaus Schmidt revealed about Gürcütepe isn't that civilizations collapse, but that they always do. What really matters is how we rebuild. Do we repeat the same mistakes, or adapt like those first settlers did 10,000 years ago? And here's the real question. Are we smart enough to learn from Gürcütepe's warning, or are we already standing at our own edge?